you very much, Dr. Butteridge, for that introduction and for reading all those titles. My titles are really wordy. It is really nice to be back here at the University of Arizona, where, as I mentioned, I did my MA in Near Eastern Studies back when it was Near Eastern Studies Department. Very happy to say now it's Middle Eastern Studies Department. And as a matter of fact, I think the last time I gave a talk in this room was when I was presenting my master's thesis. So it's appropriate that we're talking about trauma and traumatic memories today, but I hope not to traumatize any of you with my talk, but I appreciate all of you being here on a Friday afternoon. I know many of you are probably have the weekend in mind. So as Anne mentioned, the title of the talk is Save Us from the Children, Trauma, Citizenship, and the Politics of Palestinian Childhood. And this is part of a larger doctoral dissertation research project that I'm conducting, or that I just finished 2 years of field research conducting in the West Bank. And my overall research is concerned with examining the discursive construction of Palestinian childhood, again with particular emphasis on how international human rights organizations and development agencies construct certain subjectivities of childhood and children, and how children and youth themselves kind of transform and disrupt those subjectivities. But specifically the questions, I should, first of all, I'm required legally to mention some sponsors and to thank ACLS Mellon for helping me to write this dissertation research. Also National Science Foundation and the PARC, Palestinian American Research Center, for funding my field research. Any of you who are interested in doing field research in Palestine should take a look at the PARC website. They're very, very helpful. Also University of Kentucky for numerous different types of support, and CMES for inviting me here today and also helping me start on this path to research many years ago. So again, thanks for that. Specifically though, for today's talk, I want to focus on a few questions. The question I want to consider today is, what does it mean when Palestinian children are rendered visible only to the extent that they suffer or threaten to inflict suffering? What kind of political subjectivity is mobilized when children are framed through the discourse of trauma? And what other ways of being political are rendered invisible? Finally, given the significant role that international aid and development agencies play in constructing places and identities for children in Palestine, what kind of future citizens do these agencies seek to produce? And again, how do children themselves enact their own politics of citizenship in their own daily lives and interactions? Those are the questions. And I have a few arguments that I want to develop through this talk. First of all, I want to argue that trauma is constructed, that trauma simultaneously serves as a justification for humanitarian intervention and is also produced through those interventions. Further, I argue that the discourse of that trauma relief defines traumatized Palestinian youths as a potential risk to society, a risk which must be mitigated through technologies of self-management. So implicit in trauma relief projects is this threat that if the psychological problems of Palestinian children go unattended, their pent-up emotional energy will be released violently sometime in the future. So there's always kind of this inherent risk that it must be mitigated. Finally, I want to argue that notions of self-expression and self-esteem and self-empowerment that are intrinsic in these trauma relief projects are enrolled within a wider governmental project of Palestinian state building. While trauma originally served as a medical humanitarian justification for solidarity with Palestinians during the Intifada, today trauma relief is used as part of a resurrected post-Intifada, post-Arafat project of neoliberal state building, which seeks to render the Palestinian population manageable through rational self-management. But I also hope to demonstrate in this paper that whatever the underlying discursive assumptions inherent in these projects, these discourses do not determine a particular outcome, but that children show great flexibility and creativity in combining these multiple discourses of Palestinian childhood. So the structure of the talk today is I want to provide an overview of trauma and humanitarian psychiatry as it's used in the Palestinian case. Then I want to go through some of the specific examples that emerged in my fieldwork and how trauma is mobilized with projects focusing on children and youth. And finally, I kind of want to look at the empirical research that I did with children and youth themselves and how they play with this discourse of trauma. Now, I'm going to leave this slide up here. It provides very broad brushstrokes of the history of international humanitarian intervention in Palestine and the development of an international NGO kind of sector in Palestine. There's a whole long history to that, which we can talk about. That could be another lecture, but I want to leave that up there. There's also a whole long history of the medical discourse of trauma and where that comes from. Trauma originally emerged out of the First World War, actually, with combat psychiatry. Later, sort of critical mass develops in post-World War II era with work with Holocaust survivors. And this is where trauma became most widely known. It was also used in the feminist movement in the US to bring to light issues of domestic abuse and violence against women, which had previously been kind of seen as a private issue in the home. Trauma helped publicize that issue with the medical discourse. Also Vietnam veterans. It's a highly political, but also it has a long history within the medical psychiatric community. Also too much to go into today. But I did want to kind of weave together some of these strands of humanitarian psychiatry and international humanitarianism in Palestine for the purposes of this talk. So humanitarian aid has been a feature of Palestinian refugees' lives since they became refugees in 1948. Likewise, international donor-assisted development has played a central role in the ongoing state-building process in Palestine since at least the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. And in response to the First Intifada. But far from satisfying Palestinian aspirations for peace and sovereignty, the Oslo peace process and the Palestinian state-building process has resulted in the further fracturing of Palestinian land, expansion of Israeli settlements, and increased militarization of the territories. These factors resulted in the eruption of much more violent clashes between Israelis and Palestinians during a second Palestinian Intifada starting in October 2000, and that violence was ratcheted up even further as part of the US global war on terror. So the spectacular violence of the second Intifada and the violent response of the Israeli military spurred an international response. The language of trauma provided the main justification for this response for two reasons. One, because the medical sector, the health sector in Palestine was already very well developed. Palestinian doctors had a long history and experience of dealing with physical violence, so they didn't need any help really. But the mental health sector was lacking, so that was an area that there could be intervention. The second reason was because trauma relief serves two purposes. The emphasis in trauma relief is through telling your story, through recounting the events that happened. So there were two purposes for this. One, aid organizations could go in and provide relief, listen to people, but also those stories could then travel around the world and create awareness about what was happening in Palestine. So the language of trauma created space in the global public sphere for the Palestinian narrative to be heard. This was very important. But it's also important to remember that trauma, as much as it enables political maneuverability, it also delimits political agency. The language of trauma risks infantilizing Palestinians, limiting their political subjectivity to that of childlike victims. As Feldman argues, humanitarianism limits humanity by reducing people to their victim status, requiring them to appear as exemplary victims and not political actors in order to receive recognition and sympathy for their suffering. And I think this is a key reason why Palestinian children especially have been such visual examples of trauma, because they're seen as being apolitical. At least they've been rendered such. Moreover, trauma summons a range of disempowering practices that aim to alleviate individual suffering and injury without addressing the structural violence of occupation. Finally, while stories of suffering and abuse speak real truths about people's lives under occupation, a focus on injury alone presents an impoverished view of the Palestinian experience. As Fassen and Rechtman remind us, Palestinian stories of the past and aspirations for the future are not fixed in the landscape of trauma. So what I'm really interested in is looking at how children themselves are forging paths out of this heavily trodden terrain of trauma and how they're enacting new political subjectivities in the process. Now, I just referred to Fassen and Rechtman's study. It's a really interesting study, and I heard some of you are interested in NGOs. It's called the Empire of Trauma, I believe, and it's looking at humanitarian psychiatry. Now, their case study looks at large international NGOs operating in Palestine after the Second Intifada, mostly Médecins Sans Frontières and Médecins du Monde. But what their study doesn't capture is how the discourse of trauma has now become ubiquitous at all levels of Palestinian civil society, and not just in response to the crisis, any humanitarian crisis, but again as part of a state-building effort. I do have a slide here. So these are all direct aid flows to Palestine, not just official direct aid flows, but any kind of international project. This is the dollar amount in millions from 2001, after the second Intifada started, up until 2011. And so we see the two big spikes right here, 2001. Again, this is when the second Intifada had just begun, and there was a lot of violence being inflicted upon a largely urban civilian population. So this was a humanitarian crisis that the international community was responding to. 2009, what's happening? Not a lot, actually. Arafat dies, things kind of slow down by 2005. We have the Hamas elections in 2006. Then we have the Palestinian Authority takeover of the West Bank, which the US supported in 2007 and 2008. There's a lot of internal Palestinian fighting, but things are pretty quiet. So what this is, it's part of the Salam Fayyad-driven state-building process in Palestine, which was funded mostly by international organizations. And when I was there in the West Bank doing this fieldwork in 2009, it was just visible on the landscape. The checkpoints were opening, huge influx of aid money was coming in, new building projects were happening, the likes of which I'd never seen. And numerous new small NGOs were popping up, and a lot of them doing projects against, with children being one of the sectors they were focusing on. I do want to show one other slide. And I think these visuals kind of help us to see the ways in which children have sort of multiple competing political subjectivities in Palestine, and the way those subjectivities have shifted throughout the years. So we have the famous picture of Fares Odeh, the 12-year-old boy in Gaza. This was taken, I think, the very first months of the second Intifada. This to me shows the overlapping of different political technologies that the Israelis were using, right? So we have this image of a boy throwing a rock, right? It was very familiar to us from the first Intifada, when it was more of a popular uprising. Youth were very much involved, women, families, community groups, neighborhoods, uprising against a largely police-style occupation. So this image is still here, except now the occupation, thanks to a state-building effort and the Oslo Accords, it was more like two armies that were fighting each other. So we have the violence has been ratcheted up. There's now tanks and F-16s, but you still have this image of the child throwing a stone. This led to another image. We have Muhammad ad-Dura, who was killed in his father's arms. Again, this was very early on in the second Intifada. This image circulated around the globe. It was one of the images that helped attract a lot of attention for the humanitarian response. And we see this, again, the subjectivity of the suffering child emerging. And it had a huge impact in the Palestinian psyche as well, because it was seen that fathers couldn't even protect their sons. And the state, and Arafat, the father of the nation, couldn't even protect the children. So children became rendered as sort of helpless victims. But they're also threats, right? At the same time they're innocent victims, they're also potentially deadly suicide bombers. And even before they're born, they're seen as being a demographic threat to the Jewish majority in Israel-Palestine. And so this image of the face-painted children, it's an image you see a lot with NGOs working with children. And to me, again, this kind of helps illustrate the conflicted subjectivity of Palestinian children, right? That they're just children, they have their faces painted, but somehow that's sort of covering up something else more sinister maybe, or maybe some suffering, right? Now, it might be useful, I think, at this point to, I'll wait for that, clarify a little bit what I mean when I talk about the production of subjectivity or the discursive construction of trauma and things like that. So it might be obvious by now that I'm sort of working from a Foucauldian perspective here. And Foucault's early work on power knowledge, specifically his histories of the clinic and the prison, were concerned with the way that discourse or knowledge acts as a medium through which power relations produce subjects by delineating the borders of what is utterable and knowable. In his later lectures, though, Foucault's genealogy of the modern subject turned from a concern about the way docile bodies were acted upon through power knowledge to the governing of the self, what is often called governmentality. Lemke provides a useful definition of governmentality. The term pinpoints a specific form of representation, Government defines a discursive field in which exercising power is rationalized. This occurs, among other things, by delineation of concepts, the specification of objects and borders, the provision of arguments and justifications, etc. In this manner, government enables a problem to be addressed and offers certain strategies for solving or handling the problem. Okay, so in this analysis, the gaze of the humanitarian organizations produces the discursive field of trauma, which then becomes a specific problem which can be addressed. Now, what is important to remember, although this concept is called governmentality, is that this is part of a continuum, as Limke puts it, that extends from the political government, or in this case, international humanitarian organizations, right through the self, into what Foucault termed technologies of the self. So, for instance, Barbara Cruikshank, and I have some quotes from her, she's examined the role that civil society organizations in the US play in reproducing democratic subjects, specifically with projects aimed to empower people, right? Self-empowerment as a mode of governmentality. And her work on self-esteem is very instructive to this research. With the self-esteem movement, Cruikshank contends that the self is made into a terrain of political action, specifically a terrain that carries with it new political possibilities for government, for self-government. So it is through the self that social problems are territorialized and government solutions are organized. As Cruikshank writes, building self-esteem is a technology of citizenship and self-government for evaluating and acting upon ourselves so that the police, the guards, and the doctors do not have to. Now, Limke argues that this is specifically a neoliberal strategy, which entails shifting responsibility for social risks onto the domain of the individual and transforming this into a problem of self-care and self-responsibility. Now, going back to the context of Palestine, if governmentality, right, is about management of populations as opposed to controlling territories, then promoting self-care becomes a way of managing the population through the terrain of the self. Viewed in this way, we can see that the role of the international NGOs and civil society organizations, the role that they play in Palestine, is one of relieving the occupation of its burden of managing the population, freeing it instead to focus on the occupation, annexation, and control of territory, of physical territory. So it's the strategy of separating the population from the physical territory, which I would argue international NGOs have a role in. Now, but my goal is not just to, and I have a quote here from Desserteau, my goal is not just to make clear how the violence of order is transmuted into a disciplinary technology, but rather, this is the positive part, to bring to light the clandestine forms taken by the dispersed tactical and makeshift creativity of groups or individuals already caught in nets of discipline. So this isn't just about cataloging the myriad ways in which power traps us in discipline, but looking at how the creativity of individuals and groups deal with the situation and how they make do. I agree with McKee, who argues that a renewed sensitivity to issues of time and space, coupled with a strong focus on a resistant subject, represents a return to, as opposed to a departure from Foucault's thinking. And I would add a welcome departure from the political pessimism that often pervades text-centered approaches to subjectivity and governmentality. This is normally where I would talk about methods, and I think methods often get a real short shift in talks and in articles, but with an eye to the time, I'd have to give my methods a little short shift. But maybe, I know some of you are grad students thinking about this, so maybe we can save that a little bit for Q&A. I should just mention, though, that there's a little tension. I'm in a subfield in geography called the Geographies of Childhood. It's sort of an emerging subfield, and there's a little bit of tension in this field because as part of the sort of new social studies of childhood, there's been a real emphasis on qualitative child-centered methods, right? That the old kind of sociological studies of childhood, which just looked at children in the aggregate as kind of subjects of research that didn't really have any emotions or individual feelings or things like that, that was kind of rejected and it turned towards more qualitative individual research with children. That's very positive, but there's also concern in geography that what's missing is a larger kind of political, social context. And all we get is kind of these micro-geographies of personal experience. So what I'm trying to do with my research is combining an adult-centered research, on one hand, doing interviews with NGO workers, teachers, school psychologists, parents, also doing participant observer work in NGOs and youth centers to try to understand how these discourses are produced. At the same time, carrying out child-centered research, conducting focus groups with children, doing child-led tours of the camp, doing participatory photography and video with kids, mental mapping, drawing, working with them on sort of on the individual level to see how they perform and transform these discourses themselves. So these are some of the methods I'm using. Again, I've sort of been talking about the theoretical foundations of this, but I should, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the West Bank, talk a little bit about my research site. Most of my research was conducted in Balata refugee camp, and it's the largest camp in the West Bank population-wise, with about almost 25,000 people. One of the smallest area-wise. It's about a quarter square kilometer. And I chose this camp specifically because it had been the site of intense violence in the Second Intifada, and because there was intense humanitarian activity there with lots of development projects going on with children and youth. In addition to working with a number of community organizations, I also had long-term engagement with 6 different groups of kids, 2 groups of boys, 2 groups of girls, 2 mixed groups, all with about 6 kids each, but oftentimes they bring cousins and neighbors and things, so it would kind of grow. But about 36 participants aged between 11 and 14 years of age. I specifically chose this kind of middle childhood period of early adolescence because younger children are often the target of psychology research, which looks at how the conflict affects children. I was more interested in how children kind of themselves affect the space. Also, older youth are kind of already inscribed as political. So I wanted to sort of see how children transition into political categories, even though they still sort of act like kids. Just to situate things geographically, Balata camp is here in the West Bank. It's the largest camp in the West Bank. There are larger camps, obviously. Most of the inhabitants of the camp come from Jaffa to Balata. The children I worked with were, in most cases, third-generation refugees, so their grandparents were the original refugees in 1948. This was what the camp looked like in 1950, when it was officially designated as a camp by UNRWA. They purchased a square kilometer of land, or a quarter square kilometer of land on which the camp is still housed, but the tents have been replaced with concrete houses. This is not a very good image here in this light, but this is Balata camp here. It's still confined to this area. This is Nablus. There's 2 other camps in Nablus. They've all kind of spilled over into the urban territory. I now want to kind of turn to my actual empirical work with youth organizations and NGOs in Palestine and looking at how this trauma discourse is put into practice. So first we have this notion that all Palestinian children are always already traumatized. So while language of trauma is useful in drawing attention to the often hidden psychological scars of war, paradoxically, this focus on the human suffering and individual healing can also obscure the very context that the occupation occurs in. So rather than being used to draw attention to the violence of occupation, the language of trauma is used to sanitize any perceived political content of work with children and provide instead a sort of a safe medical discourse. So we have this quote here: "The target group has suffered from political violence, leading to educational and social and behavioral problems, and the development of negative psychological conditions." But nowhere in this or other similar proposals do they ever mention an occupation, right? So again, they're suffering from past and ongoing violence. Children, and there's another quote here, children between the ages of 8 and 11 suffer from violence and harsh economic conditions, but there's no real specification of where this violence comes from or why there's harsh conditions in the first place. So in addition to this assumption that Palestinian children are always already traumatized by some unnamed violence, there's also an implicit threat as to what will happen if this deep-seated trauma is left unaddressed. For example, the mission statement of a Palestinian NGO targeting war-affected children and youth states that they seek to improve the physical and mental health of children by providing alternatives to violence and a safe space for children to release their frustration. Here it is assumed that Palestinian children don't have any alternatives to violence. That just their daily lives are already so violent, they have no other alternatives, and so therefore external intervention is needed. And external intervention is needed not to protect them from violence, but to protect everyone else from their potential violence in the future. The potential violence is also implicit in another project that talks about improving psychosocial health through specifically creative and artistic means. And again, this is another theme we see a lot, using the sort of calming, civilizing effects of art and creativity to calm these potentially violent subjects. Again, encouraging self-expression, outlets for energy and emotion. These are all quotes taken from different projects I worked on. Helping children deal with their own personal problems, right? Giving them new confidence to take control over their lives, right? They have to take control over their lives. There's often, in addition to personal development, often an emphasis on professional development too, right? And there's another project I worked on that used blogging and internet education. It was a good project, it was very positive. But one of the two kind of components were mental health, because if you blog, you're going to express yourself and you're going to cure yourself of your trauma, and also professional development. So it's this idea that, you know, if you're kind of thinking about your professional development and your role in the workplace and entering this global workplace, there's a lot of emphasis on technology and English language, then you would not want to become a violent Palestinian in the future. You would just want to be a good, productive worker. Okay. Again, I can give lots of examples, but I'm cognizant about the time, so I want to turn to my work with children themselves and how they kind of inhabited this landscape. And I'm going to show some images, and all these pictures were taken by the children I worked with in research, in many cases through these types of projects, right? Okay. So in a focus group interview that I conducted with boys and girls in Balata camp, before I could even start, 12-year-old Wafa had a question or two of her own for me. So, do you want to know just how bad things are in Balata, or do you want to know the good things too? Because it's important for you to see both. It's important for you to see the bad things about the occupation, about how people suffer, but also about how we help each other and how we live together. When talking about the negative effects of the occupation, her friend Shireen talked about the fear. It's not as bad as it was during the Intifada, but the army still comes at night. There is shooting and they use grenades. It affects the children psychologically, especially the little ones. Wafa agreed. Until now, you will still find injured people from the Intifada, injured psychologically as well. When you see someone killed or you see your house destroyed, that will affect you forever. A child who is injured or witnesses violence, that will stay with him his whole life. But in speaking about their own personal experiences witnessing the violence of occupation, the girls and boys explain that people have different emotional responses to violence. As Ihab, one of the boys, put it to me, for me, I was young during the Intifada, so I don't remember much. I remember shooting and people yelling. I remember being scared, but it doesn't affect me today. But other kids, I think they're nervous. Similarly, Shireen admits that she was scared of the soldiers when they came to her house, but unlike Ihab, she says that it does affect her still today. As she describes it, I still remember when the soldiers came to my house. They blew open the door with a bomb, and they took my older brother. And when the soldiers came back, after a while, they took my two uncles as well. One is still in jail, and the other one is now living in Nablus. I was young, so it affected me. It affected my psychology. When they took my uncles, I was in 4th grade, and I was very afraid. But when they came a second time to take my older brother, I was in 5th grade. I talked back to the soldiers. He looked at me like he was going to hit me. And then he started to go past me, and I just started hitting him. She laughs. I started hitting and yelling at him to leave. He looked shocked and confused. Then the soldiers started yelling at each other, and then they left. It's just something I became used to, you know? They try to scare you with their weapons. They use psychology so that you will cooperate. So we have to show them that we're not afraid. Here then, rather than being depicted as a moment of injury, in need of healing through education and self-expression, Shireen's encounter with the soldiers is described itself as a moment of empowerment, learning, and self-development. Now, issues of violence came up in another research group that I conducted with boys and girls in Balata camp. This was another mixed group. And this was part of a photography project. And the children were asked to take pictures of places in the camp that they felt some connection to or felt were significant in some way in their daily lives. And then the children then sort of chose images that they liked from all the photos they took and made a story, right? And they had to decide what the theme of that story was going to be. So, and these are images taken from that project. And this story, the children chose to focus on the cramped spaces of play in the camp and how the children use their own creativity and imagination to transform them into spaces of childhood. The children felt that such a story would acknowledge the difficult circumstances of life in the camp, while also highlighting the creativity and resilience of the people. As one girl put it, these pictures show our struggle, how despite our hard life, we still have life. We still have skills and interests. So rather than being used as a story to invoke sympathy, the children intended it as a sympathetic message to other children. As Yasmin put it, when I think of kids in other parts of the world, like in America, I think they probably have really bad problems, and they feel weak sometimes. So when they see what we are doing, they will feel inspired to be strong. So I really like this quote because it really inverts the whole geography of international humanitarian aid, right? Us international researchers and humanitarian aid workers, we're the mobile ones who go around the globe and save kids. And here she is completely inverting that, saying, we want to reach out to those kids in America and inspire them because look at how great we are and how strong we are. So again, these are some of the pictures they took of kids playing in the space of the camp. I'm going to try to hurry up since we've got some time. Now this picture, this one was controversial in my group. They were trying to decide which picture should go in this story. And Nasser, one of the boys in the group, he objected. He said, this is not appropriate. We're trying to show spaces of play in the camp when this is a picture of a gun. It's violent. I don't like this picture, he said. It's too violent. It doesn't fit with the idea. But Nasreen, one of the girls in the group, disagreed. No, it shows that there is freedom. Now Nasser was incredulous. He immediately objected. What freedom? There's no freedom here. But Nasreen insisted. Yes, but the picture shows that although we don't have freedom, we still struggle. We still have abilities. Like we have the ability to create pretty pictures, even on the walls of the camp. So there's this focus on abilities and skills, which they talk a lot about in these projects. But again, it's being used not as sort of this sort of self-empowerment, but through transforming the space as a direct act of resistance against the conditions of exile and occupation. Now, while this group debated the place of violence in their story, another group chose to focus their entire story about what they called athar al-ihtilal, the effects of violence. They were clear that this was not just the physical effects, but also the emotional, familial effects of violence. And they had a number of actually really amazing pictures. This one is of a destroyed home. It's this kind of conspicuous blank space in an otherwise very crowded urban area of what was a home, and there's a whole story behind this home. The children like to play there now. They took lots of pictures of bullet holes, the tunneling through the walls that occurred in Balata camp in 2002 and 2003. And again, children kind of hanging out in these spaces. But it became clear that these images weren't for external use, right? These images, they gave me permission to show with you, but they also conducted interviews with families about the destruction of the homes. Many of the children, they were very young when this happened, so this was the first time of kind of learning about this. So instead of this sort of appeal to sympathy, to this trauma, it became again an act of I would argue, sort of intercommunal, intergenerational care and commemoration, right? And they were using this to connect with other people, not just sort of an individual catharsis, but to ask their neighbors what happened here, and to learn. And as one of the boys in the group said, he interviewed one of his neighbors and made a video about it, which I don't have for this reason. He said, the video we made isn't for the people outside. It's for the families and the people of the camp, like something nice to give people to remember the martyrs. So beyond reproducing familiar visual representations of suffering for external viewing, or photographing traces of violence as part of personal catharsis, the act of representation becomes an interpersonal and intergenerational act of remembrance and solidarity. So, although projects that seek to relieve trauma in children often obscure and depoliticize the context of occupation, children use the creative means often employed in these projects, such as video and photography, to highlight the violence of the occupation and to emphasize stories of resilience and care and solidarity. However, in some cases, children chose to avoid the language of violence, occupation, suffering, resilience, resistance. All these familiar political categories they eschewed. All these categories employed by international aid workers and international researchers, and sometimes just produced pictures like this. in this. When I asked the boy who made this picture, I really wanted to know what's the real big significance of this. He said, it's pretty. And this, to me, was an act of resistance, right? Here I was trying to put everything, all these actions the kids are doing in some political category. He was just saying, this was cool, we found this horse, and we tried to feed it potato chips. And that was it. And to me, this is part of telling the truth of Palestinian childhood. It's about horses, too. So I think that's where I'll end for now. Yeah.